Daniel Coleman, who is an assistant professor of women's gender and sexuality studies and an affiliate faculty in the Department of Africana Studies at GSU. He earned his BA in Latin American Studies from Cal State East Bay, MAs in Performance and in Theater Arts from San Jose University, and a PhD in Communication Studies with an emphasis in performance from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Dr. Daniel Coleman's work is squarely situated within clear theoretical foundations and intentional praxis in the fields of Africana studies, women's gender and sexuality studies, feminist studies, trans studies, decolonial geographies, and performance studies. Their written work has been published in such esteemed journals as The Black Scholar and a number of edited collections, including Bigger Than Bravery, Black Writers Respond to the Pandemic, Shutdown and Uprising of 2020, Gender Futurity, Intersectional Autoethnography, Embodied Theorizing from the Margins, and the award-winning Black Trans Prayer Book. His forthcoming book, For Life, Pedagogical Lessons from the Pluriverse, will be published with the Ohio State University Press next spring. In addition to their written publications, Dr. Coleman has an active artistic repertoire. He has completed 3 artist residencies, one of which was international, and 8 other performances. His performance work spans the gamut between solo artistry, duets, and full casts. Additionally, Dr. Coleman has exhibited visual work in 3 different countries and has an active track record of performance pedagogy conducted in the United States, Spain, and virtually through Zoom. Their interdisciplinary, international, translingual work adds significantly to the tradition of Black feminist performance studies and is situated at the forefront of Black trans feminist work and the growing body of work theorizing a pluriverse and how specific cosmologies imagine and access multiple worlds. So now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Daniel Coleman to present Black Gender When Our Existence is a Threat.
Thank you so much for that beautiful introduction, Dr. Bascom. So if I may, I'd like to take the liberty to read the first half of what I'd like to talk about today, and then to speak extemporaneously. For the second half, challenging myself to become more comfortable with that, because I am so interested in my work speaking to multiple audiences. So bear with me as I read this first half and then speak the latter half. So first of all, good evening, everyone. I'd like to thank Dr. Jonathan Gales, and Dr. Leah Bascom, and the Auburn Avenue Library for African American Research, History and Culture for organizing this important series out of their home department of Africana Studies, my affiliate department. I'd also like to thank my home department, Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, for supporting my scholarship, teaching, and rebellious ways of being in many worlds. And I'd also like to dedicate this particular talk to my fabulous GSU students. I was compelled to share some of the work that emerges from my teaching, writing, and organizing practices in this lecture series because I sit as a young scholar, writing, thinking, and living in the lineage of what gets called the Black radical tradition, a term first coined by Cedric Robinson, but certainly not owned by him or other scholars. The Black radical tradition is an international field of resistance by Black people around the world who refuse our exclusion from the species we call human, and who choose to fight for the best of what life has to offer us in a collective move towards true freedom, agency, and bodily autonomy, as well as our birthright to have our very existence be enough. Or, as Dominique Thomas and Tabby Chavot put it, quote, a collection of cultural, intellectual, action-oriented labor aimed at disrupting social, political, economic, and cultural norms originating in anti-colonial and anti-slavery efforts, end quote. My efforts and commitments as a person, as an intellectual, as an artist, and as a teacher are aimed at continuing to dismantle the colonialisms and enslavements in their present iterations and their attempts at ongoing continuation that we are living with. Let us recall that the Freedom Schools were started to give Black children, especially poor and under-resourced Black children, the education that they were otherwise being denied in their schools, particularly education about Black history in this country, so that they might critically read histories and not internalize inferiority. In light of the ever-increasing list of banned books, the barring of AP African American history, the attacks and censorship of drag queen story hours, and the removal of any literature or content that addresses gender or sexuality in many elementary schools, we are yet again in a contemporary moment rife for connecting freedom to intellectual emancipation. These various desperate attempts to censor knowledge do the opposite of what they think they're doing. They demonstrate the sheer power of information about human history and behavior, and the importance of learning how to think, to truly think. The constant attempts to dismantle critical thinking is an important chess piece for racial capitalism. Compelled by this call and what I see as a responsibility in my role as a steward of critical thinking, I invite you to come with me on a journey into thought's capacity to impact how we hold expanded consciousness in our very bodies. Take a moment to breathe in and breathe out for a second. So first, allow us to set the container for our listening and for our conversation, and this will also go for people who might listen to this talk and conversation later. The intention is not to play oppression Olympics, but to understand the collectivity of critical resistance and existence that gathers around Blackness in the hopes of beckoning us all back to ourselves and to interrogate our own internalized isms and get a bit freer. Since Blackness is not inherently radical, and since radical, if we're operating by Angela Davis's definition of the term, meaning grasping things from their root, is not inherently pro-Black, in continuing the legacy of this tradition, we must gather on shared ground amongst all our differences. Our thinking together tonight and always is an exercise in observations about white supremacy, colonialism, racial capitalism, and dominant or mainstream culture's pathological attempts to control what and how we know about ourselves, about each other, about where we come from, about who our people are, and about the worlds in the plural that we inhabit. The threat is that we are actually the only ones who can name without any accuracy, with any accuracy, the realities of any of this information. Following this brief time together, I invite you to be in a daily practice with yourself and others in your life, if you are not already, where you choose to abandon the psycho-emotional scarcity mentality of racial capitalism, so that our encounters with one another are not determined by a fixation or an obsession with lack, with there not being enough. If we follow the principles and knowledge of cultures and people from millennial times, even if we cannot reverse the destruction that has already been caused to this place we call home by those in dominant systems of power, let us at least retain the abundance we can produce in the spaces between us, where there's room for everyone to come as they are. To say this another way, there's room for all genders, there's room for all sexualities, there's room for all bodies and embodiments, there's room for all the manifestations of Blackness, gathering in the spirit of getting us all a bit freer. What we create between each other simply is. Come, create with me. The space between us is not scarce. Who am I? I guess that depends on who you ask. What's important for you to know tonight is that I am Black on my paternal lineage, mixed race, transgender, non-binary, queer, neurodivergent, and part of a deep and vast spiritual community. I am a transplant from the Bay Area, California, where I was raised under the leftist guise of multi-culti 1980s babies, only to choose, as Beyonce says, to go back to the South, to go back, where my roots ain't watered down, growing like a baobab tree of life on fertile ground, and where the ancestors put me on game. My father made it clear to us that both sides of his lineage were enslaved in the US South. Since he was born in 1941, this means my great-great-grandparents. The land calls me and I respond to its call. It feels like a special kind of poetic justice to work as a Black trans professor in a region of the country where my ancestors were forcibly brought and held captive. And so, for the privilege, honor, and responsibility that my education and position have afforded me, I choose to contribute to Freedom Pathways. In what remains, I'd like to offer 3 entryways into expanding our thinking rather than politicking away truths. Miseducation, manipulation, gaslighting, and blatant lies take up too much of where most people get their information from. What we can do about it is to know what we know and to act accordingly. Okay. One, the history of gynecology and the unmooring of gender. It wasn't until well into my 20s that I learned about the history of gynecology from a group of queer and trans disability studies scholars working to rename the parts of anatomy normally attributed to quote unquote females, and then again by Black feminist thinkers retracing the legacy of this history as one directly linked to crises in present day Black maternal and infant mortality. Having taught this history now to college students for over 7 years, including those studying nursing and medicine, it is of note to me that not once have I encountered a student who has been taught this history in a classroom prior to mine. You might have heard the name Dr. J. Marion Sims, who became known as quote unquote the father of modern gynecology for successfully creating a surgical repair for vesicovaginal fistula, an opening that forms between the wall of the vagina and the bladder that often results from tearing during vaginal childbirth. J. Marion Sims was tasked with quote unquote helping enslaved Black women to be able to continue to reproduce for the benefit of US empire after the US banned the further importation of enslaved people from the African continent in 1808. Because of this, the Southern US became known as one of the most advanced places for obstetric medicine in the world, met with a massive influx of white doctors working in the field. This was in sharp contradistinction to the sheer barbarity of how the practices that got obstetric medical procedures published in internationally reputed medical journals came about. What's important to know here is that enslaved Black women were handed over by their masters and their overseers to be operated on by white medical doctors in plantation hospitals throughout the South, where they often served as nurses and assistants to these doctors as well as patients. Famously, we often hear the names Anarcha, Lucy, and Betsy as the enslaved Black women amongst those subjected to this torture. I say torture intentionally because none of this work happened under any kind of anesthesia or numbing treatment, creating the trope of what Deidre Cooper Owens has termed medical superbodies. Sound familiar? This history only adds many layers into the fold of the brilliant work of other Black scholars and thinkers who have acknowledged how the transatlantic slave trade was inaugural to our understandings of Blackness and Black gender today. The utter dehumanization of this colonial encounter and process of removing people from their homelands, kinship formations, families, senses of self, origins, languages, spiritualities and religions, lands, foods, practices, futures, dreams, and aspirations, perceived, named, and treated Black people in this new territory as something else. It inaugurated the very idea of Blackness as we presently know it. But Black people under this colonial condition did not have gender. Gender, as we currently know it under white supremacist racial capitalism, is something inaugurated by colonialism. Not existent prior to colonialism, no, but existent in the way that we presently know it, not existing prior to these conditions. This distinction is really important. Black people not having gender that was recognizable within the fold of the order of the colonial world was a result of their non-existence as people under this order. Famously, scholars like Hortense Spillers have offered that it is through Black women that this particular empire was built, and that all other Black genders must honor the role of Black women, given that childbirth into enslavement followed the law of partus sequitur ventrum, or that which is born follows the womb, which means that the offspring of enslaved Black women, regardless of the race of the man who provided the DNA for their formation, gained the status of the mother. And I'll move into my more extemporaneous part of this. There are two further points and offerings that I want to make today on the basis of this historical formulation. One of those comes from the artist Hari Ziad, who wrote the piece for Afropunk, where they said, "My gender is Black." What's important about "my gender is Black," and even in the debates of it within Black community, intracommunal Black community, about the expansion of gender and the expansion of sexuality, is that we are living under the legacy of the colonial conditions that never were met with a suture between Blackness and gender as we know in mainstream society. There are a number of important points I want to make on this front, particularly as people respond to, and I'm speaking of Black people particularly, might respond with negative reactions to expansiveness of gender. What we mean by this, and the reason that we have to go back to these inaugural moments where there was a disconnection between Blackness and humanity, and therefore Blackness and everything else that is attributed to humanity, means that there's space. There's actually capaciousness within this reality to reimagine Black gender. By this, I do not mean to suggest that Blackness is inherently queer, or that we should abolish gender. And these points are really important to me because I think that these mentalities end up recreating a distance between the spaciousness and the possibility of evolving into an openness in relation to gender, and foreclosing upon other possibilities and welcoming people who might identify as what we have come to term cisgender or heterosexual into the fold of more expansive Black genders. For those who may not know the terms, cisgender is a term that has come from gender studies to refer to people who identify with and feel aligned with the gender that often gets conflated with sex that they were assigned at birth, what we tend to know as female or male. And heterosexuality being the imposed given, that these people who identify as men and women and who are assigned as male and female at birth are the only natural relational formation that should exist. So when we say the reason that I choose to move against the abolition of gender is that the abolition of gender does not take into account the reality of the decoupling of Blackness from humanity, and therefore from any connection to gender and sexuality as we normatively know it in mainstream culture today. So this look back to history is not under the assumption that there were African cultures that had these beautiful or utopic non-binary constructions of gender. I'm not interested in that project because I think it's too vast and varied, right? To really make a singular argument about what existed prior to colonization. If anything, it is instructive to us about how there's always been a plethora of understandings of what gender is, what sexuality is, what kinship formations are, particularly in relations to land, home, child rearing, and culture. So I do not stand for the abolition of gender because, given the history of enslavement, the history of gynecology that I just shared with you all, it is my understanding that it is still radical, for example, to claim the space of Black woman. So my work aims to never erase that radical space of Black women, while also opening ways for other Black genders. So to say my gender is Black, also following Ziad, is to say that for us, for Black people, gender and Blackness cannot be decoupled, right? In an intersectional, in a feminist analysis, that means that we must be taken in our wholeness and not in the compartmentalization that we are constantly boxed into in the world as we presently know it, right? In the socio-political world that we move through on a day-to-day basis, we show up as we are, and we ask to be received accordingly, right? I believe that this is the most emancipatory project of Black gender, rather than one that seeks to say, no one should choose any gender at birth, or no one should choose genders outside the binary. I think both of these need to go. So when we say my gender is Black and these other brilliant and creative reformulations of gender, of Black gender and of Blackness coming from artists, organizers, and other thinkers, we are saying that our unintelligibility is deeply intelligible to energies beyond that which structure this idea of the singular world that we live in. And that moves me to my third point by way of offering, before I offer some more thoughts. Becoming inhospitable to singularities and universalities of all kinds, a trans lesson. So for the last 7 years or so, I have been thinking about what troubles me in the present conditions of the United States, in this dual party system where I personally no longer feel represented by any of, never felt represented by the political arena that we are working in, and certainly don't feel more represented now. The type of political position that I believe it is imperative for us to take is one that is also cosmological, is one that is also spiritual, is one that recognizes that there are no singular realities to which we can be accountable for. Part of the problem that I see with the banning of AP African American history, with the banning of drag queen story hours, with the blocking of children receiving care and treatment that they need for their own gender transitions, for their own gender understandings, alongside the coming to consciousness that some people are just having about injustice around Black people, right? Or that is very recent for people in certain privileged positions to even have to think about these things. These aspects of our social fabric are unraveling at the same time because they have to. Because one of the things that they demonstrate for us is that the project, right? The project of white supremacy, the project of radical conservatism is to try to align bodies, hearts, and minds with a singular idea of reality. So myself and other thinkers are contributing to this concept of the pluriverse rather than a universe, which is the assumption that, right, and the knowing, the deep knowing, even the conviction that this thing that we call the one world is not real, right? If anything, there's a singular planet that we operate on, but our very loose use of world makes a myriad of assumptions that are inherently colonial, right? The colonial project was a project that sought to control knowledge, resources, people, box us into nameable, supposedly intelligible and nameable realities that were actually a stripping. So as we come into and move forward into a fullness, to not say back, right? Because there is no back. As we move forward into fullness, as we recognize gender possibilities, as we recognize sexualities outside the norm, genders and sexualities outside of what was presented to us at birth, outside of what was presented to us in our mainstream social environments, and outside of what was presented to us in classrooms, and even amongst friends and colleagues. As we come into this, right, we have to acknowledge that part of what we're coming into is the rupture of knowing that there were so many worlds that existed prior to the multitude of colonial encounters and imperial encounters ongoing that try to name a single narrative of human experience. So what we're doing in this work, in the scholarship, in the organizing, in the thinking, in our homes, with our relationships, with our friends, in our encounters, is holding the space for the vast messiness that is the only real, right? To attribute a singular reality also smells of what Abrahamic traditions, I think of the main religious traditions, particularly Catholicism and brands of white supremacist Christianity, have attempted to organize around a singular idea of what we should believe, of what we should know, of what we should think about ourselves, and what we should think about the hierarchies of, between the species that we call the human and amongst the other species that we call non-human. This unraveling has to happen together, because as things are crumbling before our very eyes, in these very institutions that we continue to occupy and continue to try to create spaces in, however successfully or unsuccessfully we can in these compromised spaces. One thing that we are, that I hope that we can acknowledge more together is this space of the pluriverse, right? Another aspect of this that I believe is really important in our consciousness, right, in our intellectual understandings of what we're doing, even though there are psycho-emotional aspects of these becomings and these unbecomings, of the ways that we name ourselves, the ways that we transition, the ways that we understand our genders, the ways that we embrace our sexualities, the ways that we come into being, is that there's an aspect of perception involved. Perception, according to other spiritual traditions, for example, the one that I practice, and spiritual traditions around the world, understand that perception creates reality. And spend any time amongst a group of people who feel very passionately about any given thing, for example, Blackness or gender, and you are likely to encounter a wide variety of perceptions. Perception alone in shaping what we think we know, what we think we see, is a piece of the intellectual puzzle that I believe we have to think about more seriously, right? What I see in mainstream media, what makes me feel deeply disturbed about where people are getting the information from, where people are learning from, is that there's this idea that there is a singular perception that is right. There's a singular perception that we should all hold in order to be together in this reality. Those of us who choose to embody what is true for us, right? Which is to depathologize transness, for example. I am a trans person who loves my body, who has a beautiful existence, who has had so much joy and freedom in their queerness and relations because of this queerness, because of the community, because of the Black women elders that hold me, and because of the deities that sanctify and bless my existence. I know that I do not need to be intelligible to anyone outside of those who love me. And this point of entry, this point of perception, for me has made me feel passionate about opening space other than supremacy, right? Supremacy being the singular notion, right? The singular idea of reality into which we are all attempting to be, right? They're attempting to corral us, right? And I don't say us as some, it's easy to go into this thinking and think that there's a conspiracy theory or this amorphous conglomerate trying to manipulate control. We see this presence very, very overtly in politicians, in parents, in white supremacist organizations, in media, in disinformation, misinformation. I see this presence, particularly with trans people, making us out to be scary manipulators, dangerous for children. These very, very intentional tactics really only serve as examples of why we have to exist in our fullness, right? The fear, the sheer fear, um, goes beyond phobia and isms to me and into the realm of the delusional, which is also another piece that we have to talk about. So what I see as the purpose of the scholarship, as the purpose of this artistic creation, as the purpose of putting this work, putting this energy into the world, of understanding ourselves as more than these singular narratives, as more than this idea of one universe, one people, is that we as a species were never meant, it was not our destiny to hold singular beliefs about ourselves, to hold singular beliefs about culture, about gender, about sexuality. It is part of the absurdity and the absolute delusionality and nonsensicalness of white supremacy and colonial control. And the last thing that I would offer, I shared in my Black Feminist Thought course, and I hope that there are scholars who are taking this up more seriously, because I will not be the one to do it. So often, for those of us who are descendants of people who were enslaved, we hear the work, for example, of the epigenetics, post-traumatic slave syndrome, and what it means to carry grief, to carry legacies of pain in our bodies that don't actually belong to us, that belong to those who came before us. I don't hear the same thing being spoken about in terms of descendants of those who colonized this land and felt that they were ordained by God to dehumanize and subjugate all who were not white and you're a descendant. I remain curious about the epigenetics of that type of delusional supremacy. I hope somebody else will do that work. Don't feel that I have the bandwidth or space to do that. My lane is clear. But with that, I'd like to just close with these open thought experiments and many permutations and percolations of this that show up in my teaching and my thinking and my making and my writing. What the ongoing question I have in this moment of such terror and such environmental horror that confounds the racial terror is, what spaces are we going to make amongst ourselves, in our homes, in our classrooms, in our relationships, particularly amongst other Black people and people of color, where we are not foreclosing on all of the possibilities that our very reappropriation of Blackness, a critical relationship to Blackness, allows for our genders and sexualities, right? Allows for our embodiments. While I don't hold a lot of confidence in a broad scale cultural shift, what I do hold is confidence in Black community and in Black people, to understand the stripping that we have inherited and to dance inside the joy and creative possibilities of what else there is, because we have always been unintelligible to this empire. So we might as well be all that we are. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Coleman. So if you have questions, please, use the Q&A. We're going to open it up now. If you don't mind, I'm going to take the liberty of asking the first ones. So I had one question or two questions that are related differently, and I was thinking about audience. So one, who do you see as the audience of your work? You've always positioned yourself within a conversation. So not just who are you conversing with, but who do you want to hear it? And then two, in thinking about a pluriverse and thinking about perception and understanding, is there a limit to the audience of each experience? And if so, how, if, should folks negotiate those limits? So you've kind of offered your own example in terms of who you see your audience as, but what does that look like for other experiences or multiple experiences?
Thank you for that. Audience has been such a intense grappling for me. Even in my forthcoming book, the hardest thing with the comments from readers and editors and other people was, who you have to land on an audience. And I think that's very challenging because for me, audience is challenging because we have so many different entry points. And so following the work of Kevin Kwashi's most recent book, my audience is Black people and other people of color who understand ourselves in relation and understand ourselves as historical subjects working under empire, working under white supremacist stranglehold and having to navigate these worlds. And the Pluriverse as a project is something I think about every day, particularly with the environmental collapse. I keep wondering if the worlds of Octavia Butler are what's coming in our lifetime, because it kind of feels that way. Maybe I'm a doomer in that way, but
you're not the only one.
Yeah. So I think one of the problems is this idea that our work is supposed to be for everyone, that who we are supposed to be available to be received by any audience. And what I find really promising about a pluriversal orientation or pluriversal way of coming together is it provides something other than the goal of conversion or proselytizing into spaces that feel safe and aligned in a binary system and in a system that was founded by ideas about very strict and conservative Christian values. I think it's I've heard the refrain used in a lot of intellectual spaces, well, aren't you just preaching to the choir? And I find that question lacks an understanding of the environment that we're in, right? So there's so much assumption that we are steeped in the same reality when we meet up in the same place, for example. And I think the academic institution is the perfect example of that, right? The assumption that we go home and have the same experience, the assumption that we leave these spaces and our lives look and feel the same is the first problem. And so when I think about pluriversal thinking, I'm thinking about people who want to gather around a way of being outside of the imposed and inherited violence. And so there's a choicefulness there, and a choice away from trying to corral people into singular ways of thinking or create other supremacies, and to simply refuse that approach, to do something different. And the power and agency that comes from no longer looking for a stamp of approval from that which could never recognize us to begin with.
Thank you. So I'm gonna allow Dr. Gales has a question he'd like to ask, if you want to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Dr. Bascom. Dr. Coleman, that was amazing. I want to thank you for such an honest and intimate and vulnerable presentation. It's inspiring and, of course, brilliant. one of the things that I think is important for us as scholars, practitioners, artists, thinkers, teachers in this space is to help students see themselves in us. And I was just so moved by the deep introspection that is so apparent in everything that you said, thoughtful and it was generous in that way. And I'm struggling. I had a question, but I'm struggling with it. I think what I wanted to ask is if you could speak to your younger self. I'm moved by your self-awareness, right? And if you could speak to your younger self about your journey, what would you want your younger self to hear from you, with the context being for those people who are in the audience that are on a similar journey of awareness. I think it's important for us to give them a sense of our own journey, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that question. Oh my gosh. Well, I've had many conversations with my younger self, but if I could go back now, I think the hardest, I had a conversation with a student yesterday, that what I have come to understand at this point in my life that I wish I had had more access to younger, was to just not internalize any of it. And I think that is, and I think when I say any of it, people know, probably know what I mean. There is so much time that you have to make up for in your life even when you're living your truth, you're doing you. It's the subconscious, the excavation of the subconscious, where you actually believe there's nothing wrong with you.
Right.
Where you actually know there's absolutely nothing wrong with you. And it took elders, it took spirit, it took many, kind of fashion me upside the head to really be in practice of that. To not say that I have arrived, because it's a lot, decades to unlearn.
Right.
But to choose to be in the practice of that and to not sideline that, regardless of how challenging the hustle gets, right?
Right.
Regardless of how much, school and work and family and what have you, and financial precarity, would have you displace that or put it on hold, to find what any slivers you can to excavate that internalized inferiority, because you will be, you'll just be open to better relationships, better relationship with yourself, better relationship with everyone around you. I say this knowing that it's really hard when the influx can be constant, right?
Right.
Where it doesn't end. But so then your practice has to get deeper and stronger. And to learn to even stand up, right, to authority, to parents, to family, to those who are choosing to only see from their lens. That's what I think is so powerful about the pluriverse. There's an arrogance in the assumption of singularity, right? There's a hubris in the assumption of singular perception, singular ways of being, that us being ourselves, unapologetically or what have you, whatever that looks like, blackity black, trans, queer, fabulous, what is the lesson, right?
Right.
It is the confrontation that other people have to do and not ours to take on. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to the Q&A. So first, just some props. Angela says, great talk. Thank you. Philip Lipcott says, thank you, Dr. Coleman. It's been a privilege and a blessing to hear you this evening. And then we have a question from Vic Kennedy. Hi, Dr. Coleman. I'm so intrigued by the conceptualization of pluriversality. I wanted to know if you in your theorizing see this conceptualization as overlapping with postmodernism in any way, or with the assertion of such a privileging of the colonial theoretical canon.
Hmm. Hey, Vic. So yeah, for me, the connection to postmodernism would definitely be a privileging of colonial canons. The thinking around pluriversality, um, a plug that my book coming out in March, I talk a lot about it. Pluriversality really comes from people who began thinking alongside and with indigenous people in the Americas. The example of the Zapatistas being one of the prime examples, because one of their emblems is un mundo donde quepan muchos mundos, or a world in which many worlds fit. And so pluriversality is a concept that's not driven by academic knowledge, though it has made its way into academic theorizing and thinking and publishing. What's beautiful about that for me is particularly even what the freedom schools, what the legacy of freedom schools is, that blurring the boundary between the university and the rest of life, right? And so I want to keep pluriversality as something that is coming out of indigenous organizing for autonomy, which we could also connect to maroon communities, right? To other types of rebellions and refusals and resistances that said, and continue to say, we will not be absorbed into the nation state. We will not let the nation state decide what our worlds look like, and what our lives consist of. Mm.
Thank you. So Christopher Van Bukering says, lovely talk. And then we have another question from Parker Blair. Thank you, Dr. Coleman. Can restorative justice practices be a viable approach to addressing threats to Black existence, particularly in cases of racial and gender-based violence? If so, how do we as a community close the gap in praxis and tangible neutralization of a threatening existence?
Whew. I'm glad we're going to be talking about this in Black Feminist Stop. So absolutely. I definitely believe in the project of abolition, because of what jails and prisons have done to our people, to our communities, to this country. And it's restorative justice is very, very challenging, I will say, because there's complex trauma that enters restorative justice. There is poverty, there is complex mental illness, and learned behavior that is oftentimes based in trauma and survival. And so while, yes, I absolutely believe restorative justice is one of, restorative and transformative justice are some of the tools that we can turn to, they are imperfect because of these other realities. And something that I've seen in organizing spaces that often, unfortunately, is the downfall of them are these other factors, right? Particularly trauma and mental illness. And the challenge of that being that trauma and mental illness affect the lenses through which we see, and the lenses through which we feel, and the lenses through which we know. And so I think that is to say that I think restorative and transformative justice needs to have a process of rehabilitation, maybe before we even get to the restorative justice and transformative justice circles, right? The opportunity for people's complex needs to be addressed, the opportunity for people to have access to, something beyond Western therapy, right? Things that are culturally resonant, like dance, like drum, like song, like food, right? That is a piece that I see missing, and that continues to fail people over and over again. And so when it comes to racial and gender-based violence, especially if it's coming from outside, I don't have the answers. I wish I did. You know, I wish I had seen examples of things that work every time. What I do know is that I don't think locking people up is a solution. What I do know is that the criminalization of Blackness, the criminalization of transness and queerness, only drives people deeper into mental health crises and trauma that I don't think you can ever fully recover from in a lifetime. And that level of violence, I'm so tired. I'm so tired of. And I think restorative and transformative justice have a lot of hope and promise, not the full answer. And I'm curious to see what, if not answers, approaches we'll come up with in the future to try to keep more people in community. Yeah. So,
Thank you. Dr. Lakita Burnett Bailey says, excellent lecture, Dr. Coleman. And then I have one more question, if that's all right. So I wanted to get back to your understanding of land, right? You said the land calls me and I respond to its call. And thinking about the many different places that you've worked in its relationship to land, you're in the South now, you've been in the Bay, you've worked in Mexico. What does it look like for you to respond to the call in different spaces, in different lands? And specifically in this kind of eco-terrorist moment, where, you know, the land has a lot to say. And more specifically, especially in terms of how you talk about being in the South with your history, what does it look like to respond to the call to the land, responding to the racialized, gendered histories in conversation with the pluriversal possibility?
This is totally like, I feel like I need to give a spiel about the book now. It's like, yes, I feel like
I'm
I
trying to
spend
get
a
you to
lot.
talk about it.
Yes. So the book title, I'll say that the book title has transformed. It's refusals and reinventions, and specifically focused on the connections between Black and Indigenous life in the Americas. So I have had to make decisions to move called by land and sea, rather than making decisions based on job, for example. So I've had to, you know, I've been fortunate to well, yeah, a lot of things had to align for me to be able to stay committed to place, right? And so I wouldn't just take a job anywhere, which is against what they tell you in academia, you go where the job is, because my commitment is deeper than the job. And so that has not been an easy path. And fortunately, I'm in the position I am now. But that response to place for me has meant a commitment to remaining. I think what has been so beautiful about being in the South, and being in Southern Mexico is just seeing how deeply committed people are to freedom, to transformation, in places where the historical legacy is so palpable, is so present, is so everywhere you look. And that is the work that my spirit is called to be inside of. And so there's a commitment to land and place beyond, it will be fun to live there, right? Or oh yeah, that's cool. I'm gonna go there now, right? It's a let me be inside and inside of and alongside of these um, struggles that are really based on, but we deserve more than this, right? We deserve more than this. We deserve to show up in the fullness of our humanity and to, a big part of my heart is Black Brown Coalition. And being inside of Black Brown coalitional work because of the relational subjugation of Blackness and indigeneity throughout the hemisphere. Yeah, and just the other aspect of being called by the land is being inside of a spiritual cosmology that understands that, and not in ways that New Age Western descriptions would have it, but that the land is inside of us, right? That the cosmology that we are refusing inhabits us. And I found that the more that I've opened myself up to that reality, the more I feel like I don't really have a choice but to respond. I mean, I can choose not to, but it's going to be existentially deeply painful for me. Yeah.
Thank you. So Jacora Johnson has a comment. Hello. I had the pleasure of hearing you speak at NWSA last year, and it changed my perspective on how I view the lives of Black folks post-colonization. Truly, thank you. My question was, how did you go about creating work that is both vulnerable and creative in your thinking, while also finding support in these academic spaces?
Here's another one where I don't have a perfect answer. What I can say is that I have been curating this way of doing work since my master's degree. Well, really since the beginning of my college education, because I, perhaps because of the way my mind works, who I came into this world as, I don't feel that I'm represented by mainstream academia at all. And somehow they still keep me. No, but I think part of it has just been, being inside of an integrated life creation thought practice, because I can't do it any other way. There's so much, I think so much of Western life and capitalism is about, compartmentalize yourself to do this and compartmentalize yourself to do that. And my work won't let me. Every time I try, people are like, what is this? This is trash. This isn't you. What are you doing? I'm like, oh, you're right. Okay, let me go back and do. So it's an orientation for me. It's an orientation. It's a way of existing in space, which again has meant combating a lot of canons, right? Being the person in grad school who was like, excuse me, what's happening here? Being willing to be perceived as the unapologetic one, as if that was a slur for several, for years of time. But continuing to find the people who, and the mentors, and the friends and the colleagues who were thinking in similar ways, right? And thinking about thought and life and creation as part of why we're here, right? Not a means to an end of career advancement. So for me, it's been really about staying in the integrity of that, as hard as it has been, because it has not been easy by any stretch of the imagination, but creating a way out of no way, creating a way out of no way. Yeah.
And so we have another comment from Day Scarberry. Thank you for your knowledge and presence and for sharing so generously with us. And if I can add to your answer to Jacora, I would say as a colleague who wants to support you, some of us out here value, you know, things differently, even though we're in academia. And I think, you know, I had this conversation in class. One of the privileges, the biggest privilege about being a scholar is that what you don't know, you can learn, right? And I think that sometimes our structures forget what that means to explore. And so to have folks close and in the space that can consistently remind all of the people and the structures that this is what knowledge production can be is extremely valuable. So thank you so much for your work and for your presence.
Thank you so much for your work and your support and your presence. And the last thing I would say on that point is something that I've laughed about a lot and existing in academic spaces and see a lot in conference spaces is the way we create this fiction of the academy as if it's the Academy Awards. And I'm like, what are we talking about? There are multiple, there are multiple academies. And so I think this idea that, precisely what you're saying, this idea that there aren't, like-minded colleagues and friends and scholars who are here doing the thing is just not true, right? It's just not true. It's not mainstream. It's not the canon, but it's here, and that's why I'm still here. And wanting to create that space for those coming up to continue to carve out of the crumbling institution what we can while it's still here. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I think that's it for this evening. Do you have any last thoughts, last comments for our audience tonight?
Just thank you all so much for being here. Thank you for your beautiful, beautiful comments and really thoughtful questions. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, everybody, for your attendance. Thank you, Dr. Coleman.
Thank you, Dr. Weston.